So in this podcast, we're going to look at how you create a student timetable and how you can work to support the students with their workload over the course. So it's really important that we support students throughout the PGCE year. It's a very tough year for them, and we need to make sure that we give them as much support as possible to manage their workload throughout the year. So we now see the course as having three main phases. Shared collaboration being the first phase, guided development the second phase, and supported independence the third phase. And these are across the whole year and not just across a single placement. Underpinning this, we have the idea of gradualism of the uptake of the student timetable, a tailing off of the support for planning and teaching across the year with a lot of support at the start and reduced support across the course of the year. The same happening with the expectations for the planning detail. And we're hoping that those working together will ensure that student confidence builds over the year and also independence, enabling them to start an NQT year with confidence. So it's absolutely fine, and it is absolutely expected that you should give lots of support early on with planning and gradually scaling this back across the PGCE year. You should also expect to give high levels of support at the start of Block B, because students often experience a real dip in confidence during this time, so you will need to give them higher levels of support, but this can often tail off a little bit more quickly than in Block A. So this is the absolute essence of shared collaboration, and we see shared collaboration as being joint planning, and the students having full access to the resources to allow them to grow in confidence by using a school scheme of work and tried and tested resources and activities. We wouldn't expect, and we shouldn't expect, students to walk into a classroom and use resources that they've created themselves. We wouldn't expect a newly qualified teacher to do that if there's a scheme of work in place with all the resources. We would expect them to use that, and we should have the same expectations for our student teachers as well. We should only expect students to come up with creative and innovative teaching ideas when they've gained confidence both in their planning and in their classroom practice. And then we should limit our expectations of this. You wouldn't expect an everyday teacher to have an innovative and creative lesson for every single lesson that they teach in the week, coming up with brand new resources and ideas every time. And we have to have realistic expectations of our students too. Gradualism for the timetable uptake is one idea, but there's also gradualism in the support and expectations of planning. And we're going to look a little bit more now at the detail of planning. So in terms of the expectations of planning detail, there should be a balance between the timetable uptake and the amount of detail you expect the students to write into their planning. It's absolutely fine to expect them to write full lesson plans with lots of detail, particularly early in Block A, but don't expect them to know about differentiation or assessment for learning early on. They're not going to have the knowledge and the skills to plan lessons with this early in Block A, but joint planning will help them to develop these skills. You can then move to detail of lesson planning that just focuses on the development targets rather than everything. So for instance, in a weekly mentor meeting, if you decided that AFL was a target for the student for that week, then there should be a focus in the planning on AFL and less detail should be required for the other areas of planning. You can move from individual lesson plans to planning series of lessons, and it's important that you're looking for evidence of planning, that you're looking for this through the resources that the students create, the dialogue that you have with the students, and perhaps you might want them to use your own school planning pro forma that other staff use. But we're looking for evidence, and we know that Ofsted look for evidence of planning. They don't necessarily require full detailed lesson plans to be written for every lesson. Obviously, the expectations of planning and support will vary between students. Some students might need a little more support for longer, but therefore they might take up their timetable a little bit more slowly. And please remember that this idea is across the whole course and not just across a single placement. Of course, students should still produce a full lesson plan for formal lesson observations, and they are still expected to reflect and evaluate each lesson as they take place during the week. Please remember that a number of students have their own specialism but are also expected to teach other subjects. So for instance, A physics specialist would also be expected to teach chemistry and biology, and they would probably need more support for the planning and teaching of those areas that they're non-specialism areas, and that would need to continue for a little bit longer throughout the course. So if we have a look at the teaching experience expectations across the calendar, we can see on the calendar that there are various percentages identified across Block A and across Block B. And these are for guidance, but they have been determined in a way that is going to help the student to grow in confidence, but also meet the requirements of the teaching experience for appropriate judgments to be made. So in Block A, the timetable for students runs from Monday to Thursday, regardless of whether they are a core or a school direct student. And this continues until late November, early December. The teaching contact time therefore rises to 50% over 5 days, and the protected time decreases to a minimum of 50% over 5 days too. So on Fridays, all of the core students will be in university until late November, early December, and the school direct students will either be in university or involved in school-based training at their Alliance Lead schools. And of course, from late November, early December, all Fridays will be spent in school. In Block B, the timetable automatically runs from Monday to Friday, and the teaching contact time rises to 60 plus 10% over 5 days. So the protected time decreases to a minimum of 30%. Just a note on the 60 plus 10%, the extra 10% is contact time, but is not actual planning and teaching. And this is to give parity for all subjects. We know that some core subjects could easily find a 70% timetable, but other subjects couldn't. And we need to ensure that all students are having the same experience. So we want them to lose that 10% of free time, of protected time, so they've got more contact with the students, but they've not got the extra burden of all the planning and marking that comes with the extra teaching. So it's 60% teaching plus an extra 10% of contact time. Gradualism is very important in the uptake of the timetable, and the calendar indicates what the teaching experience expectations are across the year. This helps to manage the students' workload, and it helps to avoid them being overloaded at a time when they are taking a long time to plan lessons. It'll help hopefully to build their confidence, and please remember that the rate of timetable uptake is unique to each individual student. But you need to allow students time to consolidate their teaching before they start taking on more classes. Please be careful with those eager students. Sometimes students arrive and they feel that they've really got something to prove and they want to prove that they can take up their teaching very quickly. But very often they can maintain this for a couple of weeks, but it tends to unravel quite quickly, often with disastrous consequences. So please do try to hold them back and ensure that they take up their timetable at an appropriate pace. It's a gradual process. It's not a race, so please make sure they understand that. They need to be teaching sufficient classes, however, to make a progress judgment at Review 2A and Review 4, and they also need to have been teaching their full timetable for sufficient time to be able to make a judgment at Review 2B and Review 5 as to whether or not they have passed the placement. But the guidance on the actual calendar will work with this to ensure that they meet those requirements. In terms of what we mean by teaching, this could be solo teaching, where they take responsibility for the class on their own. They might be team teaching with the usual classroom teacher. Perhaps they'll be paired teaching with another student, or they could be teaching in a university schools model trio. It might be that they're working as classroom support for some of their timetable, and this is probably particularly the case if they're working with exam classes, for instance, Year 11 and Year 13. And we do ask that as part of the contact time that one lesson a week they are doing directed observation. So they're not teaching the class, but they're observing good or outstanding practice across the school. This lesson can be what we would call a floating lesson. It doesn't have to happen at the same time every week, but it should be included as part of the timetable. And there is an expectation that students are going to discuss what they've seen during these lessons when they meet their mentors during their weekly mentor meeting. Protected time is for planning and preparation. It's also for the subject mentor and any professional mentor meetings, and these need to be indicated on the timetable. And it's also when the professional issues sessions will take place. Once again, these should also be indicated. In terms of form time and duties, we get asked quite a lot about this. Form time is a really important experience, and students should only observe this initially. There is an expectation of time devoted to this, and that's very much dependent on the length and frequency of form time in the actual school. So for schools with a longer form time involving planning of activities or perhaps PSHE lessons, then please use the 50 to 60% model relevant to the block and include this in the teaching load. For schools with a short form time, maybe just 10 minutes in the morning, then the students might be able to attend this each day, but you need to negotiate this. Do be flexible, particularly where a student is teaching a lesson straight after form time. They can quite often become quite stressed if they've got to do a form time at one end of the school and race back to teach another lesson at the other end of the school. So a bit of flexibility is important here. Please remember that students should not assume responsibility for a form until later in the placement and only when they've developed confidence in the classroom setting. Students should also experience break, lunchtime or after school duties. That's a really important experience for them. But one a week is absolutely sufficient. And if you can manage to vary these duties, then that will benefit the students. So perhaps for 2 to 3 weeks they do a break duty. The following 3 weeks maybe they do a lunchtime duty, and following that an after school duty. But just one a week is sufficient. In terms of PSHE, they can teach this if it's an expectation of the teachers in the school, but it must be included in the usual 50 to 60% teaching load. Finally, on a note about absence of colleagues and absence of students. Students must never be asked to cover for absent colleagues. This is an absolute no. A student can still teach their lesson if the usual class teacher is absent, but only if appropriate cover is provided in the room. So either a staff member or a supply teacher must be present in the classroom. If a student's absent themselves, then you can ask them to pass the information on about the classes that they were due to teach that day, but they should not be expected to set cover work as a usual expectation. Finally, just a quick look at the timetable template that the students will use. As you can see, there's an area for information to be completed about the school and the school address and the names of the subject and professional mentors. Please can you make sure that that is completed in full. Obviously, this area can be adapted to suit the number of lessons that the school has, but we would really ask that you make sure that the times of the lessons are recorded, because when a university tutor needs to arrange to come in to visit a student, it's really difficult to do this if we don't know the times that the lessons start and finish. Finally, at the bottom, if you can add any of the information that's shown here in terms of half-term holiday dates, or perhaps when the subject mentor might be available to discuss the student progress when the university tutor visits, that would be very helpful too.